Hi, I'm Debbie Godwin, retired Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army Signal Corps. I started my career in 1977, graduating as the first female to be commissioned into any service at the University of Mississippi, otherwise known as Ole Miss. My first assignment was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and they still wore berets back then, but that didn't last very long. And then from there to Germany, where I was privileged to serve in an artillery brigade for several years as their chief signal officer, and then really fortunate to have 2 company command tours down in the Frankfurt, Germany area. Then from there back to the States, Fort Benning, Georgia was one of my favorite assignments. I got to serve in an infantry brigade, and from there, Fort Hood, Texas. This was a great assignment. We were fielding what was considered very new technology back then, the mobile subscriber equipment, and we were the first unit to field that. It was pretty exciting, very successful, and we got to work a lot with defense contractors, which was my first real exposure to that side. It was a great tour, and then from there to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where very tough year. They tell you it's the greatest year of your life because you're not deploying. However, I also did my master's degree that year, so it was pretty grueling. But I'm happy I did that. And from there, of course, was my first assignment here at Fort Huachuca. I was the deputy IG, and then I was deployed to Somalia. I took my signal flags off, I took my IG brass off, put my signal flags back on, and I was the G6 for U.S. Forces Somalia. When I got to Somalia, I realized that I was leading a very diverse group of folks that had never been in the same unit, and there was some friction and some lack of confidence in each other. So I was trying to figure out a way to make this diverse group that had come from all over the Army into a team. So I was talking with the Zimbabwe commander, and he challenged us to a game of volleyball. And I accepted the challenge. And thankfully and amazingly, after watching their practices, I never would have thought this would happen, but we actually beat the the Zimbabwe's, and it was a blast. And my guys had a great time. The general had given us permission to have a couple of beers, so it was a nice break with all the tension that was present every day in our service in Somalia. I think the thing that moved me the most was the way the soldiers reacted the night the Black Hawk went down. It was a Sunday and very quiet. We always gave as many of our soldiers off as possible so they'd have a chance to write letters, watch a movie, just relax. Everything was very, very austere there. The only electricity we had was from generators. It was a miserably hot, humid place. But anyway, all of a sudden I walk into the ops room and I hear the chatter on the radio, and pretty soon I realize what's happened. And before I even have to get excited about getting my soldiers back to work, they all just showed up. And then of course they asked, what can I do, where do you need us? And they ended up going over to the hospital, where they carried litters, they donated blood, they held IV bags. They were amazing, and I was so humbled by the way they just jumped right in to serve their fellow soldiers. It was a tough night. Throughout my career, of course, there were always issues with sexual harassment, as we were pretty much the first women. I had very few women in front of me, but I truly was privileged because the majority of males that I worked with, both as peers, superiors, or even as subordinates, were very accepting. As long as I was able to do my job, that was the focus. So after Somalia, I came back to Fort Huachuca, where I became the actual Inspector General. That was another tough assignment because you're dealing with, with soldiers and government civilians that are having some rough times. But I had a great commanding general that was very supportive, great chief of staff, and it actually was a really great assignment for me. I had also gotten promoted to Lieutenant Colonel while I was in Somalia, so that made it a little bit easier to deal with some of the other Lieutenant Colonels that some of the soldiers were complaining about. So we made it all work. It was a great assignment overall. So from there, I headed to my last assignment, which was at the Army JAG School on the grounds of the University of Virginia Graduate School. That in itself was an amazing place. In the Army through the 70s and through 1998 when I retired, most officers were required to have an alternate specialty, and mine was automation. So I was very privileged to actually get to work some assignments and kind of field automation from its infancy. That was truly a great thing for me, and of course it has served me well throughout my career. But the fun thing about going to the JAG school was they didn't have any automation yet. The whole Army had finally automated, and they had, email, very basic, rudimentary email, but at least they were communicating, and they were just starting to access the World Wide Web. But the JAG school had nothing. They were not networked, they were not connected, and they were very reluctant to join the rest of the Army. However, they were overruled, and fortunately we got to field that entire beautiful building and all the instructors and cadre with a network, with email. They were able to actually send their presentations up to a network that they could download them in the classroom. The funny part to me was one day we actually had to replace the server, so they were going to be down for the day. And they didn't actually know what to do with themselves because they had finally gotten so used to email and automation. So the commandant cracked me up. He said, "Yep, I've been walking around reminding them they can go visit, they can pick up the phone. They're not dead in the water just because they don't have email today." But it was a great place to finish my Army career. And I was very, very fortunate that one of my former brigade commanders, who had become the IG of the Army, Mike Ackerman, came down and did my retirement ceremony. I was so moved that he did that for me. It was beyond any of my expectations, but it meant a lot to me that my retirement service was performed by somebody I had served with as a Signal Corps officer. At the JAG school, you're surrounded by JAG officers, of course. So yeah, Mike Ackerman did a wonderful job, very moving ceremony, and highlighted my career one more time for my husband and children, and it was very special to me. I am very, very fortunate that I was able to serve. It was never on my wish list, never on a dream sheet that I go into the Army, but in 1975, the first women were invited to go to ROTC basic camp at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and get paid. So I said, well, that might be a fun summer job, and that's really how it started. And once I got there, despite their lack of organization, as they just still weren't sure what to do with women, it was a blast, and I decided that's what I wanted to do as a career, and I've never regretted it. I've had wonderful mentors, both from my soldiers, my NCOs, and fellow officers, my senior officers. I have just truly been fortunate to lead the life I've led.